Good morning. Yes. Okay. Thanks. Thank you. I'm pastor, but I enjoy looking at the Word. So I've been able to the preaching team at our church, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with you guys this morning as well. What motivates us to make right choices? How do we inspire others and ourselves to make choices that honor God and as the sermon title mentions, why and how do we choose life over death? Motivation does make a difference in our choices. According to one study at Michigan State University, 97% of the faculty members and staff who bet $40 that they could stay with a 6-month exercise program were successful. Only 19% of a non-betting group stayed with the 6-month exercise program. Incentives matter if you want to change behavior and have people make good choices. In our passage today, we look at the ultimate incentive, life versus death, that Moses sets before the people of Israel just before their entry into the Promised Land. I invite you to come with me to Deuteronomy 30. I'll have it up on the screen, but if you want to pull it up on your phone or look at a Bible, that's fine too. We'll be starting at verse 15. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the word of the Lord. As we begin, let's put Moses' plea to the people of Israel in context. Deuteronomy 30 is set near the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which all takes place just before Israel enters the Promised Land. It gives the book a certain emotional force, as Moses is addressing the people he has seen grow up in the wilderness for the past 40 years. He knows that he will no longer be with them as they move into this next chapter of their lives, individually and as a people. The book of Deuteronomy is set up in the form of a covenant in the ancient Near East between a greater king called the suzerain and a lesser king called the vassal. So you have here a photo that I found on the internet, thanks for the internet, of one of these treaties being made. So the lesser king is on the right bowing and the greater king is on the left. So this sort of treaty would guarantee the suzerain's protection of the vassal's land in return for the vassal's loyal service and maybe payments of tribute to the suzerain. It included specific traditional parts, and each of these parts is replicated in Deuteronomy. So the people hearing it would have recognized this sort of form. So there's a preamble that describes the speaker and the addressees. There's a historical prologue, which talks about the relationship between the parties of the treaty and what has happened between them in the past. General and detailed stipulations of the treaty, what the actual requirements were for both the vassal and for the suzerain. Blessings and curses, which happen just in the chapters before our passage, and they provide the motivation for keeping the treaty. And then the witnesses, and we read that part as well, the witnesses to the treaty. The structure of this suzerainty treaty used a political form that was familiar in that day to communicate a theological message. It marked that Israel was no longer a vassal state in those days, serving a larger nation. So she had served the nation of Egypt and just came out of that 40 years ago. Instead, now due to God's action in her history, she now owed her allegiance to God alone. And this wasn't only true in the political realm, it was also true in the religious. Israel was surrounded by polytheistic cultures with many gods that made demands of the people, and idolatry, where there were statues of God who were carefully cared for in order to gain the God's favor. But as we read in the text today, Israel is called away from these practices of the surrounding culture because it represented what one commentary called an exchange of the only true source of salvation for lifeless and powerless substitutes. They turned from the Lord, who is your life, as Moses puts it, to lifeless idols. It makes me wonder for us, as we're thinking through these big themes of Deuteronomy, what has God set us free from? Who or what do we no longer have to serve due to his saving action for us? Could it be an addiction or the expectations of society or our own family? Was it sin that so clearly was leading to a cycle of more bondage, as Sean mentioned? Was it simply the need to always be right or to always be enough? And the follow-up question, how has his action called me to total commitment and allegiance to God alone instead? Where do I fall back into the patterns of this world and need to hear his call to allegiance to him alone? Where am I depending on something that's as lifeless and powerless as the idols, instead of the one who is himself life? Now that we have this context, let's look back at our text. Moses reminds them of the witnesses to this covenant. You had to pick something big, and there's nothing bigger than the heavens and the earth. So that's what they picked. And of the stakes, life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, he says, so that you and your children may live. Today is Sanctity of Human Life Sunday. The call to choose life includes this, the call to recognize the lives of the unborn and to choose life for them. It may be a call for us to support a woman facing an unexpected pregnancy. It may be a call to advocate in love for just policies that provide the financial ability for a pregnant woman to make a choice for life. It may be a call to foster a child whose parents cannot care for him or her. But this call to choose life, I believe, also includes other parts of what has been called a seamless garment of the protection of life. It includes a call to oppose capital punishment. Only God has given life, and only he should take it away. It includes a call to the hard, often slow road of peaceful non-resistance, instead of the easier, faster way of violence as our response to what is wrong in the world. And I found here a picture of Martin Luther King. I figured this is appropriate. Tomorrow's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And what an example in that way of peaceful non-resistance. It includes a call to faithfulness, even when it leads to suffering, even in the losses at the end of life that might feel that it would be easier to simply end it all. It includes a call to justice, to laws and policies and enforcement that lead to true life for all people. But the passage doesn't end there with the call to choose life. It provides reasons. First, the obvious, so that they and their children may live. But how precious. I think the older I get and the more people I know that have died, the more I value that I woke up this morning, that I'm still here. But second, so that they may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. This brings us back to motives, where we began. Israel can choose life and following God and obedience and doing the right thing simply out of self-preservation. But that misses part of the point. They're to choose it because it's part of their response to what God has already done for them, to his redemption of them, his rescue from slavery in Egypt. So we're going to look at each of these three in the second line. First, they're to choose life because they love God. He brings them out of Egypt, out of an environment of many gods, to allow them to see the one true God who loves them and to respond to him with love. I remember hearing a story once of a Muslim who started to question his faith and searched the Quran for evidence that God loved him. He couldn't find it. But when he turned to the Bible, it was there repeatedly, the love of God reaching out to humans in hopes that they would respond in love. Philosopher James K.A. Smith says that we all choose what we actually want. If we grow in our love of God, obedience comes naturally because we love him. Our heart's desires are inclined to choose right because they are shaped by the love of God, his love for us and our love for him. Smith illustrates this with a quote. If you want to build a ship, and I have a picture there of shipbuilding in Zanzibar, where we lived for 2 years, don't drum up people to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. If we want to make right choices, it has to be guided by love of God. So I wanted to give us a bit of a chance to reflect. How can we recapture the story of God's love in action, rescuing us? Because like I said, this is a response. So if we want to have the right response, we have to remember the history. How can we allow it to inspire our love for him? How can we feed our love for God and help it to grow? Second, Israel is to choose life because they want to listen to God. I don't know about you, but I can get irritated pretty quickly when I feel someone isn't listening to me. It could be my kids. I'm sure that never happens to any of you, right? Or a casual conversation, or a colleague at work. But underneath my irritation is the feeling that not being listened to means the other person thinks I'm not important enough to listen to. We have the chance every time we choose to listen to communicate to God that he is important to us, that we honor him and what he has done for us, that our listening for and obedience to his voice is our natural response to the grace we've been shown. Biblically, hearing God and obeying him were inherently linked, and that link showed the character of the person. And I found the second picture there is a painting of Samuel with Eli. I think of the story of him calling in the night, Samuel, Samuel, and him running to Eli, and finally Eli saying, must be God. And then he said, speak, Lord, for you're listening. But that showed his character already, that he was hearing and that he was willing to obey. There's that link. How can we develop better hearing, to listen more clearly to God's voice? What things might be in the way of our hearing? What way of hearing God's voice works best for you? I think some of us, maybe it's the worship time, that music. Maybe some of us it's being out in nature. Some of us it's just silence, long enough to have everything else get quiet. Sometimes it's scripture. How can we grow in the strength of the connection between our listening to God and our obedience to him? Third and finally, Moses encourages the Israelites to hold fast to God. For the Lord is your life, he says. If you want to experience life, you have to stay connected to the source of life itself. We've probably all had the experience that You plug in an electronic device, maybe your phone or a tablet or your computer or something, and then you find that the battery is still dying or dead, and you realize the other end wasn't connected to the wall. So we have to stay connected. If we want to choose life, we must hold fast to God, the source of life. So how do we do this? How do we hold fast to God? What role does community have in holding fast? How can we remain in the vine, to use Jesus' metaphor? The irony that underlies Moses' heartfelt speech in Deuteronomy, and indeed the whole beautiful covenant with the people of Israel, is that we know how the story proceeds. We know that Israel loses some of its people to rebellion just inside the border of the Promised Land when they disobey God's instructions. We know how they beg Samuel for a human king because it's not enough for them to have a divine one. We know how the kingdom splits into two halves. I have there your map with the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the prophets in both the northern and the southern kingdoms plead and yell and exhort and do crazy things to try to get the people to return to God. We know how both kingdoms end up in exile in Assyria and Babylon, torn from the Promised Land and the temple because of their idolatry and disobedience and injustice and unfaithfulness. And yet, these truths mean that the story speaks to us as God's people today as well. It means that God offers his covenant of relationship and his heartfelt plea to choose life to people who were like us. They stumbled and fell, and sometimes were blatantly rebellious and unrepentant. And that's how we are. We don't love God as we ought. There are times when we close our ears to his still small voice. We shake our hands free instead of holding fast. We choose the injustice that serves ourselves instead of the justice that costs me something. We hear God's commands, his call to righteous living, just as the Israelites heard all the laws, and we think, that's too much. Or maybe we follow them, but it's out of pride or self-righteousness, not out of love for God and our neighbor. We too fall short of the mark. We choose death instead of life. But this is where the gospel, the good news of Jesus, meets us. As Hebrews 4 says, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. The writer continues, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who was tempted in every way as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. The correct response to our times of failure is not to give up on obeying God. It's not to kick ourselves and declare, I'll never get it. It's not to declare this covenant broken, like Moses broke the first set of 10 commandments when he found the people worshiping the golden calf. Instead, it's to remember something that Philip Yancey reflects on in his book, The Bible Jesus Read, in the chapter on Deuteronomy. As Moses taught so clearly, evil is unpreventable and punishment is inevitable. But we have a God who consciously forgets our sins and consciously remembers our frailty. We have a God who travels by our side, who tabernacles among us through the vast and dreadful wilderness. We have a God of grace. May he help us to learn to love him more deeply, to listen to him more fully, and to hold fast to him more securely each day. For the Lord himself is our life. Connection to him will allow his life to overflow in us, bringing his life to the people and the world around us. Therefore, choose life so that